Rain falls in blinding sheets. A dog lies limp in a young man's arms, its eyes fading after eating spoiled vegetables. No electricity, no fridge, no hope. And from that moment of unbearable loss, amid thunder's roar and silent tears, a vow was born. I will keep things cold. Not just food. This story begins in grief and journeys through cracks in the earth to rediscover life. Subscribe now to witness stories that break your heart and heal it again in ways you never imagined. The rain had not stopped for 3 nights. Kwame's sandals sank deeper with every step on the muddy path that twisted through the outskirts of Incaranza. Red earth clung to his feet like a second skin, and every few meters he had to pause to tug them free from the suction of the ground. The storm had returned just as he left the small market square empty-handed again. He pulled his threadbare hoodie tighter around him, though it did little to shield from the sideways rain. In his left hand dangled a thin bag of withered leaves, half-eaten by rot and time. He didn't look up. There was no need to. He knew exactly what waited for him at the end of the road. The cracked wall, the leaning roof, the silence of another night without light, without power, without preservation. Home. The clay house crouched low behind a scraggle of thorn bushes, its outer wall bearing a jagged scar where last year's flood had torn off a corner. Plastic sheets fluttered on the roof like desperate flags. One shutter hung loose, groaning in rhythm with the wind. Kwame pushed the door open. It didn't creak, it gasped. Inside, the storm's echo dulled into a heavy stillness. A single candle flickered weakly on a carved stool, casting long shadows against the uneven walls. The floor, once firm-packed dirt, had softened into moist patches, each footstep leaving behind a dark imprint. Kwame entered without a word. To the right, his mother coughed. The sound was dry, persistent, like a nail scratching the inside of a hollow tree. She sat hunched on a reed mat near the fireplace, unlit, unused. Her wrapper was pulled high to her chest, more for comfort than warmth. Her eyes fluttered open at his arrival, but she did not speak. Kwame moved to the left, placing the bag of leaves on the wooden bench. His little sister, Ajoa, no older than 7, sat cross-legged beside an overturned basket. The smell hit him before the sight did rancid. Unmistakable. He knelt slowly. Inside the basket, 3 small hens lay lifeless, their feathers clumped and wet, their bodies stiff. The woven cover had been meant to shield them from rain and insects. It had only sealed their fate. Kwame exhaled through his nose. Carefully, as if not to disturb the silence, he pulled a torn piece of cloth over the birds. Ajoa looked up at him. "Kwame," she asked softly, "is there food tonight?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at her cheeks, hollow from skipped meals, arms thin as broomsticks, a light scar on her forehead from when the roof had dripped on her sleeping mat and she'd slipped while fetching the basin. Her dress, a faded school uniform, was too big. It had belonged to their cousin, who'd gone to Kumasi. Maybe some rice, he said, knowing there was none. Ajoa didn't press. She stood and went to sit beside their mother, curling herself under the older woman's shawl. Kwame walked back to the bench. The leaves he had brought were useless, a mix of contomire and garden spinach that had already begun to rot at the stems. He picked up a bunch, held it under the flickering candlelight. It sagged in his hands like regret. He carried it to the door. Outside, the wind had eased into a low whimper. He walked to the edge of their small plot and dropped the leaves beside a pile of ash and broken calabash. A dog barked in the distance. He watched the leaves slump into the mud. His hands remained clenched long after he'd let go. Behind him, his mother's cough resumed. Inside again, he sat by the wall. The candle was almost done wax, pooling around the base. Darkness crept in slow and inevitable. He closed his eyes and heard it again, the hum of silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the choking kind. The silence of too many things unsaid. The silence of hunger withheld behind small smiles. The silence of a man trying to hold a family together with his bare hands and nothing else. A drop from the roof hit his shoulder. The leak had returned. He got up and placed a metal bowl under it, then sat back down and waited. When you don't have electricity, when you don't have a fridge, you lose more than just a meal. The voice came not from the room, but from inside him. It had repeated for months now. Every time food spoiled before it could be cooked, every time they skipped dinner to stretch tomorrow's hope. His father had died of typhoid when Kwame was 14. The funeral had consumed every coin and every bag of grain they owned. His mother had sold their last goat to pay for burial cloth. Since then, it had been the three of them. And loss, small, persistent daily loss. It was never just food that rotted. It was time, effort, dignity. The room was now dark, except for a pale glow from the window slit. Outside, a faint outline of the village lay obscured by fog and drizzle. Kwame stood and walked over to a makeshift shelf. He reached for a wooden box, one of the few things his father had made. Inside were 3 scraps of paper, a receipt from an old radio repair, a drawing Ajoa had made of their house, and a page torn from a science textbook. He unfolded the last one. Evaporative cooling, it read. The diagram was faded, drawn by hand. It showed a large clay pot inside another with wet sand in between. The caption, Desert Refrigerator, Zier Pot. Kwame stared at it for a long moment. Then slowly, his fingers traced the outlines. The outer pot, the wet sand, the way airflow passed through the clay. He remembered reading it once in school. His teacher had spoken of how ancient civilizations preserved food without electricity, how they used nature not to fight it, but to work with it. He closed the box and placed it back. That night he did not sleep. The rain softened into a drizzle. The candle died, but a new light flickered behind his eyes. Not fire, not electricity. Something older, something made of clay and silence. Kwame stood under the rusted tin roof of his neighbor's veranda, soaked to the bone, holding a plastic basin filled with softening okra, half-rotted contomire, and a few bruised mangoes. His knuckles were white from gripping the basin too tight, and his voice, already hoarse from hunger, cracked as he asked again. Just a little space, one shelf, for tonight. The woman, a thick scarf wrapped around her head, shook her head without even looking at him. She was watching the rain. Arms folded, her young son clutching her dress behind her. There's no room, she muttered. And even if there was, I can't risk power cuts spoiling my own food. Kwame nodded, not because he accepted the excuse, but because he'd heard it too many times to challenge it. He turned away, walked out into the rain again. Mud caked his ankles instantly. The basin in his hands sloshed with water from the downpour. The okra floated on the surface like swollen regrets. House after house, the answer was the same. No space, no fridge, no power, no help. Each door that closed behind him made the basin feel heavier. He wasn't just carrying food, he was carrying humiliation, the kind that folds a man inward, makes his chest collapse, makes his eyes search for cracks in the ground deep enough to swallow him. By the time he reached the end of the street, the rain had turned the earth into slurry. He sat under a neem tree, placing the basin beside him. His shirt clung to his back like wet paper. He ran his fingers through his short hair and leaned his head against the bark. Behind him, a faint whining broke through the sound of the storm. Kwame turned. From the shadow of the abandoned well, a frail shape limped toward him, mud-covered, trembling. It was Yarrow, his dog. Half mutt, half forgotten breed, all heart. The pup had followed him home from the fishing dam months ago and never left his side. But now, Yarrow didn't bark, didn't wag his tail. He looked thin, his ribs protruding like the ridges of the broken road. His fur was patchy skin visible beneath scabs. When he reached Kwame, he slumped without ceremony, his legs giving way. Kwame dropped to his knees. Hey, I'm here. He cupped the dog's face, wiped the rain from his eyes. Yarrow blinked slowly. Kwame's throat tightened. The dog was burning. Even in the cold rain, Kwame could feel the heat rising from Yarrow's body like smoke from a dying fire. No, Kwame whispered. No, not you. He cradled the limp body to his chest. Rain ran down his forehead, but he didn't move. He rocked slightly the way his mother used to when he was sick. His breath hitched. If you had cold, you'd still be okay. Yarrow didn't respond. His breathing was shallow now, each rise and fall more labored than the last. Kwame pressed his lips to the dog's ear. I swear, I will find a way to keep something alive in this place. Then slowly he stood. It was midday by the time Kwame reached the old woodworking shed near the edge of the village. The building leaned like an old man tired of standing, its walls sagging inward. But inside, the smell of sawdust and burnt wood still clung to the air. It was the kind of place that held stories, even in its silence. Kwame. The voice came from behind a bench, half buried under planks and tools. A man emerged, tall, thin, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a shirt too large for his frame. It was Mr. Kwame's former science teacher. Retired now, mostly forgotten. Sir Kwame said, managing a nod. I didn't know you still worked here. I don't. The man smiled faintly. But wood doesn't rot as fast as people think. Kwame explained everything about the spoiled food, the failed requests, Yarrow's fever, the village's endless cycles of waste and want. I remembered something from your class, Kwame said. You once said people used to keep things cold without electricity. Taye nodded slowly, stepping toward an old cupboard. My grandfather, he said, used to make what he called miracle pots. We didn't have fridges either. But the inside of those pots was always cool, even on the hottest days. Clay boy. Clay remembers water. He rummaged through a drawer, pulling out a brittle brown journal. Its pages were yellowed, and the edges curled like dried leaves. Here. He flipped through until he landed on a pencil sketch, a large clay pot nested inside another sand packed between them. Evaporative cooling. The Egyptians did it. The Hausa used it. But we forgot. Kwame leaned over the drawing. It's like the textbook, he said, but real. Tay placed a hand on his shoulder. If anyone can make it work again, it's you. You're not afraid of dirt. The rain had paused by the time Kwame returned to the square. He stood near the mosque, holding the notebook like a secret. Around him, boys from the mechanic's shop loitered, sharing a bottle of Coke and half listening to a radio blaring hip life. One of them, Eli, noticed him. Kwame, he called. Looking for a job in clay making now. Kwame said nothing. You going to mold a fridge from mud? Another joked. Or maybe build a freezer out of cow dung. Laughter. Kwame held the book tighter. I'm going to build a pot that keeps things cold, he said. No power, no wires, just earth. They stared, then erupted again. Madman. He wants to sell frozen okra in a desert. Someone check if his roof collapsed on his head. Kwame turned and walked away. He didn't flinch, but inside the words carved deeper than nails. That night, he sat by the hearth with the sketch open on his lap. He traced every line with a charcoal stick, redrawing the shapes, the arrows, the airflow. Outside, Yarrow whimpered in his sleep. Kwame placed a damp cloth on the dog's head, whispering, You hang on. I'm learning from dirt. Kwame scraped a line across the packed clay with the edge of a rusted machete. Sweat dripped from his jaw despite the cool morning. He'd been shaping earth since sunrise hands, deep in mud and sand, the red clay from the riverbed thick with his breath and frustration. The pot stood nearly waist-high, lumpy, uneven, but real. He had scavenged 2 old water jars, their rims chipped, the inside crusted with old lime. Between them, he packed wet sand, pressing it firm, just as Mr. Taye's drawing had shown. The wind dried the clay too fast, cracking the top edge before he could seal the outer wall. He spat into his palm and smoothed it again, muttering under his breath. When it was done, he squatted in front of it like a man watching a newborn sleep. He placed a few tender okra and a small bag of contamere inside the inner jar. Then he waited for 2 days, but the leaves still wilted. The okra softened into mush. The air inside the pot was damp, not cool. The clay, instead of breathing, had baked under the sun. Kwame leaned his head against it on the 3rd night and let the failure soak into his skin. He hadn't told anyone he'd tried. That was the mercy of obscurity. Only you bore the weight of your own loss. The next morning, he wiped his palms on his trousers, mounted his old bicycle, and began the ride to Anyanam, a village about 12 kilometers away, known more for its funeral drummers than anything else. He had heard whispers that some elders there still used cool pits to store water and herbs. His legs ached before he'd crossed the first ridge. The sun rose fast and unforgiving. Dust coated his tongue. But he didn't stop. Not when the chain slipped. Not when the rear wheels squeaked like a dying bird. Not even when a passing truck splattered him with red sludge. He arrived near midday. A group of elders sat in the shade of a large baobab tree. Some of them eyed him with curiosity, others with suspicion. He approached with a low bow and extended his hands. "I'm Kwame, from Incoranza. I came to learn." The silence was long brittle. One man finally stirred, a weathered elder with a faded hat and the slow grace of someone who'd seen centuries of rain. "What is it you seek to learn?" Kwame explained. "About the pot, about cooling, about how the food went bad too fast, how the fridge was only a memory in their part of the world. I want to build something old," he said, "so we can eat tomorrow." The elder studied him, then beckoned him closer. They sat for an hour. The old man spoke of buried gourds of storing roots in charcoal-lined pits, of using wet leaves and broken calabashes to delay rot. Every sentence came like an offering, soft, deliberate, sacred. "You must remember," the elder said, pointing to the ground, "the earth is not your enemy. But it does not listen to impatience." Kwame nodded, his eyes wide. That night, he returned home with sketches in his head and blisters on his palms. The second attempt was more precise. He layered the inner pot with fine charcoal ash. He soaked the outer sand more carefully. He carved small ventilation holes near the base for airflow and shaded the entire unit with a scrap of roofing sheet. He wrapped the produce in dried banana leaves before placing them inside. And for a day, it worked. The temperature inside dropped only slightly, but enough to feel like a victory. Kwame smiled to himself as he measured the difference with a borrowed thermometer. He offered a Contamire leaf to Yarrow, who sniffed it, licked his hand, and flopped beside the pot with a low huff. But on the third day, the pot cracked. A hairline fracture had grown like a secret until the whole outer shell collapsed under the weight of the wet sand. Kwame stared at the rubble for a long time. He didn't move until the sun disappeared. That evening, he returned to the market square with a small bowl of test vegetables, just to compare their condition with those sold at the stalls. The difference was almost imperceptible, and yet in his mind, it was everything. He was halfway back home when he noticed Yarrow. The dog had been hiding under the porch, limp again, panting hard. Kwame knelt beside him. "Yarrow!" The dog's tongue lolled out dry and cracked. He looked up weakly. Kwame's breath caught. The small bowl had tipped in his satchel. Some of the spoiled vegetables had spilled. Yarrow must have eaten them. "No, no, no, no." He scooped the dog into his arms and ran. The village vet was located near the lorry station, a narrow building with faded paint and a metal gate half hanging off its hinges. Inside, a single table and a wire cage stood among empty shelves. Kwame banged on the door until a man in a white coat appeared, rubbing his eyes. "It's my dog," Kwame said breathlessly. "He's sick. He ate something. Please." The vet glanced at Yarrow, then back at Kwame. "Do you have money?" Kwame shook his head. "No, but I'll pay. I can work clean, Carrie. No money, no treatment. Please, he's all I have." The vet looked away, uninterested. "I can't help you." Kwame didn't move. Rain began again, softly at first. "I said I can't help," the man repeated, closing the door. Kwame carried Yarrow home barefoot, now his sandals left behind somewhere in the mud. He didn't speak. When he reached the compound, he laid the dog on an old sack under the awning and sat beside him. For hours, Yarrow's breathing slowed. Kwame placed his hand on the dog's side, feeling each movement as if counting backward from some invisible number. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have known, should have stopped you." The dog blinked, tail twitching faintly. Kwame pressed his forehead to the animal's side. "I promise if I make it work. Next time it will save someone." Raindrops tapped a steady rhythm on the roof. Then silence. Yarrow's chest stopped rising. Kwame didn't cry immediately. He sat motionless, the way you do when you know a part of you has just been carved out. It wasn't just the dog. It was failure again, but deeper. This time it had cost more than spoiled leaves. It had taken something warm. Something loyal. Something that listened when nothing else did. Later that night, when his mother came outside, she found him lying beside the sack, his arm wrapped around the lifeless body. He didn't look up. His tears had dried on his cheeks like salt lines. She laid a blanket over both of them, then returned inside. The candle on the stool burned low. The wind shifted, but Kwame didn't move. The world had gone cold finally, but not in the way he'd hoped. The morning of the burial, the sky was clear. Not because the storm had passed, but because it had never cared. There was no silence that morning, only a heavy stillness, the kind that settled not in the air, but inside the chest. Kwame stood alone in the back of the compound, behind the neem tree where Yarrow used to sleep. The hole he had dug was shallow not from laziness, but because the ground had hardened under weeks of rain and footsteps. His palms were blistered. Dirt clung beneath his fingernails. The dog's body, wrapped in an old shirt, lay beside the opening like a sealed chapter waiting for closure. No one came, not a single child from the village who had once laughed at the dog's missing tail. Not the man from the kiosk who used to throw scraps. Not even the old widow who let Yarrow sleep under her bench during the dry season. Death had a way of isolating the forgotten, especially when it belonged to something that didn't speak, didn't trade, didn't matter. But Kwame stood there anyway, shoulders square, face expressionless. A silent priest at a nameless funeral. "I called him Yarrow," he finally said, voice low and dry. "He followed me home and never asked for anything. He was always cold and I never gave him warmth." His throat tightened, and when I tried to fix that, I was too late. He placed the body into the hole with a care that defied the world's indifference. Then, with deliberate hands, he covered the dog with dirt layer by layer, as if sealing a vow beneath every grain. He placed a flat stone at the head of the grave. He carved the words slowly, each stroke of the nail etched with silent defiance. "Earth can keep cold. I will prove it." It was not just a promise. It was a reckoning. He didn't sleep that night. Didn't eat. He sat by the small table pieces of broken clay straw and sand spread before him like a battlefield. The diagram for Mr. Ty lay pinned under a rock. This time he didn't trace it, he rewrote it. He sketched new lines, changed the angle of airflow, added grooves in the inner pot's rim. He remembered what the elder in Anyanam had said: Earth doesn't listen to impatience. So he slowed his hands, measured every layer, waited longer before sealing anything. At dawn, he borrowed 2 large earthen pots from a traveling trader, both old but intact. He scrubbed them clean until the clay beneath revealed a deep, dusty orange, like the glow of fire just before it fades. He packed damp river sand between the pots, pressing gently evenly, then soaking it once more with cool water. The lid he improvised from thick straw bound with a layer of goat hide. He weighted it with a stone to ensure no air would escape. It took him an entire day. Not one moment of it felt wasted. When it was finished, he sat in front of it with the reverence of someone who had built a shrine. His fingers trembled not from exhaustion, but from the magnitude of what this object had come to mean. He selected 3 ripe tomatoes from the garden, not perfect ones, slightly bruised near the edge of spoilage. He wrapped them in dried leaves and placed them inside. Then he closed the lid. On the first day, he opened it every few hours, checking for signs of warmth. He resisted the urge to touch the tomatoes too often, remembering what Teye had said. Don't disturb what you're trying to teach, to rest. On the second day, he noticed condensation inside the outer rim. A good sign. Evaporation was working. But still he doubted. His mother watched from a distance, not saying a word. On the 3rd morning before the rooster had crowed, Kwame rose. He washed his face with the last cup of clean water and knelt beside the pot. He lifted the lid slowly, as if unlocking a gate in his chest. The tomatoes were still firm, cool to the touch. He blinked once, twice. His hands trembled again, but this time from something that startled him more than sadness. Hope. He ran his fingers gently over the skin of the fruit. No bruises, no softness. He bit into one and juice burst into his mouth, sweet, tart, alive. His breath caught in his throat. A sound behind him. He turned. His mother stood there, wrapped in her thin shawl, barefoot on the dirt. Her eyes scanned the scene, the open pot, the sand, the tomatoes. She said nothing at first, just walked forward and sat beside him. Kwame held one of the remaining tomatoes in both hands and extended it toward her. She hesitated, then took it. Her fingers brushed his. She pressed the fruit gently, then raised it to her lips and bit. She chewed slowly, and when she swallowed, she did so with her eyes closed. A moment passed, and then another. Then she did something he had not seen in weeks. She smiled, and tears welled in her eyes. Not the kind of tears that fall from grief or hunger, but the kind that come when the world shifts imperceptibly from despair toward possibility. "You did it," she whispered. Kwame said nothing. He just reached forward and placed a hand on the pot, not in triumph, but in reverence. Yarrow was gone. The village still laughed. The power still flickered. And yet something inside this crude construction, this vessel of clay and sweat and silence, had held life when everything else had failed. It wasn't a miracle. It was memory rebuilt, a promise kept, and the first stone in a road that had never existed until grief laid it down. The first time someone came to see the pot, Kwame was bent over his work fingers coated in wet clay, humming lowly under his breath. It was old Korkor from across the road, stooped with a walking stick that thudded rhythmically as she approached. She didn't say anything. She stood at the edge of his compound and stared at the pot under the straw canopy. Eyes narrowed. Kwame looked up. "It keeps things cool," he offered. Korkor said nothing, just hobbled forward, knelt beside it without asking, and lifted the straw lid. She sniffed the air like a cat. Then she turned and walked away. 2 hours later, she returned with a half-rotten pawpaw in her bag. "Put this in. We'll see." By evening, her nephew had arrived. Then 2 women from the next alley. Then a small crowd. Kwame hadn't planned on an audience. He hadn't even changed his shirt, which was crusted with dust and sweat. But there they were, watching. He opened the pot. The pawpaw had firmed up, slightly. The smell had stopped spreading. "That's not bad," one woman muttered. "But it's not cold," a man objected. "It's not about cold," Kwame said. "It's about delay. Time. One more day of freshness is one less day of waste." More silence, then murmurs, quiet nods. Curiosity, suspicious but growing, took root. By the end of that week, Kwame had built 2 more. The first he gave to a woman whose only source of income was selling spinach under a torn umbrella. She cried when he delivered it. The second went to a young mother with twins who had lost a full basin of beans to rot the month before. Word spread. Not quickly, not loudly. But in Ghana, the most powerful messages move not through announcement, but through repetition. Tongue to tongue, market to market. By the 10th day, Kwame had strangers waiting near his fence. One of them was Kojo, a wiry boy with long limbs and restless eyes. "You teach?" he asked. Kwame frowned. "Teach what?" "This thing. Clay fridge." Kwame hesitated. "It's not finished." "Still learning." Kojo shrugged. "Still want to learn." Behind him stood 3 others. A girl with grease-stained hands, a boy who used to wash trotro windows, and a man Kwame recognized from the lotto kiosk. All of them unemployed, all of them restless, all of them watching him like he held something more than clay in his hands. So Kwame nodded. "Come tomorrow. Bring your own pots." By the 3rd week, 5 stood proudly across the village, patched crude but functional. One woman began saving half her daily tomatoes from spoilage. A peanut seller in the market reported that her ground nut paste stayed fresh, even during the hottest hours. Children gathered to touch the cool inner walls, then run off laughing as if they'd touched magic. But not everyone was amused. The trouble began when a white car with tinted windows pulled into the village center. 3 men stepped out, pressed shirts, clipboards, and that unmistakable look of authority softened by condescension. Kwame was in the middle of mixing a new batch of clay near the square when they approached. "You're the one building these devices," one of them asked. Kwame straightened. "Yes." "You have a permit for them." He blinked. "Permit to distribute public-use technology, to build structures with public health implications." Kwame wiped his hands. "It's not a structure. It's just clay, pots, like water jars." "Not according to our office," the man said, flipping his clipboard. "We've had reports. Claims you're gathering money under false pretenses." Kwame felt the earth tilt. "I've never taken money," he said. "I gave them. All of them." The man stepped closer. "Then you're distributing unauthorized prototypes. Do you have government certification, laboratory results? Approval from the health board?" Kwame opened his mouth, closed it. "I built them because people asked. That doesn't make it legal." Another officer stepped forward, softer voice, but colder eyes. "We'll have to ask you to cease operations until further review. All units are to be dismantled by end of week." Kwame stared at them. His fingers still wet with clay curled into fists. "They're saving food," he said. "They're saving people, and they could also be harboring bacteria." The man replied flatly. "Unsanitary materials. You don't know what happens inside over time. You're not trained." Kwame took a breath, forced it down his throat. The girl from the mechanic shop who'd helped him mix sand the day before stood nearby with a piece of rattan in her hand. She didn't speak. Her eyes, wide and confused, flicked between Kwame and the men. "I want to talk to the chief," Kwame said finally. The officers looked at one another. "You'll have your chance," the lead man said. "In the meantime, no more pots." They walked away. That night, Kwame sat in the dark. He didn't light the candle, didn't eat, didn't even speak when his mother placed a bowl beside him and walked away. He just sat on the clay floor, his back against the wall, his knees pulled up to his chest. He had never been to university, had no degree, no grants, no papers. But he had earth. He had hands. And now, he had people who depended on what those hands could shape. And the state wanted to erase it all with a pen stroke. He remembered Yarrow, remembered the fever, the helplessness, and the promise. He pulled out a tomato from the pot beside him, cool, fresh, then bit into it, as if to say, "Even if they bury me, I will rot slower than their silence." The market square had never held its breath before, but on that Monday morning, the chatter died early. Tins of sardines sat unopened. Charcoal sellers forgot to shout. Even the fishmongers whispered their voices, dipping as the sun rose. It was 9 a.m. sharp when the officials returned clipboards in hand-shiny shoes glinting like accusation. Behind them followed two large tables rolled out like battle platforms. On one, a government-issued plastic cooler, powered by a generator parked nearby. On the other, Kwame's pot. The arena was set. The test, 5 days. Tomatoes uncut, untreated, exposed to the punishing Ghanaian heat, 40 degrees under a burning sky. One set to rest in the certified cooler, the other in Kwame's clay refrigerator. The challenge came from the head of the Municipal Environmental Health Unit, Mr. Mensah. His sleeves were too crisp for the heat. His words too polished for the market. "We are here," he announced, "to determine if traditional methods can match the standards required for public health protection." The crowd murmured. But the underlying tone wasn't curiosity, it was tension. A test was never just a test in Ghana. It was a battle of pride, of legacy, and for Kwame, of survival. He stepped forward. No notes, no prepared statement. Just a tomato in each hand and a steady gaze. "These," he said, holding them up, "will tell you everything." He placed one into the clay pot. The other was placed in the government cooler. The countdown began. By day 2, the tomatoes in the market had already started to shrink under the heat. But inside the clay pot, condensation had formed a fine halo around the inner rim. Kojo, now Kwame's apprentice, checked it every morning, tracking temperature with a cheap digital reader. The difference wasn't massive, but it was real, and it was enough. Enough to draw attention and enemies. Late on day 3, while Kwame was in the next village, delivering a clay mold to a pregnant woman, a thin man in a white shirt and 2 clean shoes slipped into the shaded corner of the market where the test was being conducted. No one noticed him at first, not until he crouched beside the clay pot and poured water into the space between the pots. Not gentle drops, a heavy splash, enough to saturate the sand, to overflow, to collapse the fragile balance between moisture and structure. A calculated sabotage. He slipped away as quietly as he came. When Kojo returned that evening, the damage had already begun to show. The sand was soggy and bloated. The bottom layer of the clay exterior had begun to darken, cracks forming like veins. Kojo panicked, ran the entire stretch to Kwame's house. Kwame didn't shout, didn't curse. He just listened, then stood. That night they returned to the market under cover of darkness, with only a kerosene lamp and the rhythm of their own breath. Kwame worked silently, hands moving with precision. He removed the outer layer, repacked the sand, this time with half the moisture. He lined the base with ash to absorb excess dampness, then reinforced the wall with a blend of dry clay and old charcoal from his mother's stove. Kojo held the light. His arms shook, but he didn't lower it once. Even Kwame's mother came bringing a reed mat, soaked in herbal water. "Wrap the top," she said. "Let the wind bless it." It took 4 hours, but they finished. At dawn they left quietly. The pot stood again, upright, dry, waiting. Day 5 arrived like judgment. The sun was merciless. Mr. Mensah was already there checking his watch, as though timing a political speech. His assistant unlocked the generator-powered cooler. The crowd had doubled. Traders, children, a few reporters from Sunyani holding cameras with cracked screens. Word had spread far beyond the village. Kwame stood beside his pot. His shirt was clean, his hands were not. The tomatoes were lifted out one by one. From the cooler, smooth, slightly softened. A few had small wet patches. Not ideal, but passable. From the pot, firmer. Not cold, but unmistakably preserved. The skin taut, the shape intact. A hushed wave passed through the crowd like a breeze. Then murmurs. Then clapping. Not wild, not loud, but from the belly. Real. A woman in the front whispered, "That tomato smells like it came from yesterday." Someone else added, "That's the one I'll feed my baby." Mr. Mensah didn't speak. His lips thinned, then disappeared entirely. He turned toward Kwame. "We'll review the findings in a written report." Kwame didn't flinch. He didn't need a report. He had tomatoes. He had eyes watching. And he had hands clapping. The crowd parted for the officials as they left a path carved more by shame than respect. Behind them, Kojo lifted a tomato above his head. "Tell me again, this pot has no power." The crowd erupted. Kwame smiled, not wide, but enough. His mother, standing at the edge, wiped her eyes and whispered to no one. "He did it, Yarrow. He kept something alive." It began with a tomato. Not the preservation itself, but the image of one. A photo snapped by a girl from Sunyani on a cracked Samsung phone posted without filters or hashtags. Just a hand holding a firm red tomato above a crowd of dust and applause captioned simply, "This pot has no power." But it works. Within a week, the image was shared over 6,000 times. Within 2, it reached Accra. Within 3, Kwame received an email he couldn't read. He found Kojo near the road holding the community phone and staring at the screen like it had spoken to him. "They want to meet," he said. "Who?" "A company. Real company. From Accra. Startup." Kwame raised an eyebrow. "Startup of what?" Kojo grinned. "Of money, maybe." They arrived in a sleek white SUV with tinted windows and silence inside. No one in the village knew where to park it, so they left it just beyond the mango tree, gathering dust for the first time in its life. The 2 founders were younger than Kwame expected, polished, confident, with expensive shoes and soft hands. But their eyes scanned the clay pots with real interest. "This is elegant," the woman said, crouching beside one of the newer models. "No wires, no emissions, just design and logic. It breathes." Kwame didn't respond. The man took photos, asked about water ratios, cooling duration, materials, sourcing, clay type, sand grain. Kwame answered each question plainly, but without pride. "Did you train somewhere?" the woman asked. "I failed twice," he said. She laughed. "That's better than any degree." The next day, they made the offer. A grant, equipment, a workshop in Accra, possibility. "You'll get 10 workers, materials, engineers, logistics, marketing, everything. We want to scale this. Mass production. Not just for Ghana, for Africa." Kwame sat in his mother's house when they delivered the news. The walls seemed smaller that day, the air too thick. "And I moved there?" he asked. "Yes. To supervise, to lead. This story needs to reach the world. But from there, from the city." He didn't answer. Not then, not even when they showed him the figures. Not when they mentioned global recognition. He stared at the clay pot in the corner of the room, the one that had held the very first 3 tomatoes. It was cracked now. Retired. But sacred. That night, he sat with his mother on the bench outside. The moon cast soft light over the dirt yard, and the night insects played their usual orchestra. She was quiet for a long time before speaking. "You won't lose me if you go," she said. "I know," he replied, "but you could lose yourself." He turned to her. "I don't want to leave the earth." "Then don't," she said. He waited. "If the earth is what made this," she continued, "then take it with you. Take the people who need it. Take the silence, the grief, the lessons. But don't take only the clay. That's not what cooled the tomatoes. He looked away. If the earth can follow you, she said finally, then take the whole village. The next morning, Kwame met with the startup team under the neem tree. I'll do it, he said. They smiled, ready to shake hands. But he added on 3 conditions. The man's smile twitched. Go on. 1, we don't build in a factory. We build in the field, on site, with local clay, in the places that need them. All right? 2, no patents without my name. No labeling this a discovery. This came from the people. From grandmothers. From dust. Not from a boardroom. Okay. 3, I stay here and train here. You want to grow it, fine. But this stays a seed in Nkoranza. The woman looked at him long and slow, then nodded. We can work with that. Kwame didn't shake her hand. He just said, start with 6 pots. I'll show you how. By sunset, the village gathered to watch him work, not for the first time, but differently. This time, the pots weren't just for survival. They were for something else. Something like a future. Kojo passed him water. The girl from the mechanic's shop carried sand. Even the lotto kiosk man showed up offering a new lid made of old bicycle tire. Kwame bent over the clay and pressed his palm deep into the side, leaving an imprint, not a signature, just a reminder that something shaped from the earth could carry fire, cold, and memory, if only you were willing to stay close to it. The email arrived late at night. The kind of email that carries too many exclamation points, too much cheer, and no breath of truth. It's happening, launch in 2 weeks. Accra Mall rooftop. Sustainable showcase. The Earth fridge now branded as Terra Cool. Get ready to be amazed. Kwame read it 3 times. Nowhere in the message was his name. Not once. Not in the header, not in the body, not in the attached PDF of the event flyer. There was a logo, slick, digital, and cold. A stylized clay pot with a sleek silver lid floating in midair, surrounded by icons of leaves, clouds, and data graphs. He stared at the screen until it dimmed, then stared some more. 2 weeks later, he stood outside the rooftop garden of the Accra Mall Arms, crossed feet dusty from the 5 a.m. Trotro ride he'd taken just to make it on time. Inside, under a white dome tent with gold chairs, executives sipped lemongrass tea and nodded thoughtfully as a young man in a blazer walked them through the innovation. There it was, his pot, but not. It was smoother now, mass-produced, polished with an eco-plastic lid, instead of straw lined with polymer clay, instead of river earth, and displayed on a bamboo pedestal imported from Vietnam. The presenter tapped the lid gently. This revolutionary off-grid cooling device blends ancestral wisdom with cutting-edge design. It empowers remote communities while offering a chic, sustainable alternative for modern homes. A slide changed. Brought to you by Terra Cool Labs, another funded by Greenbridge Ventures. Inventor collaboration in-house. No Kwame, not even Nkoranza. Just in-house. He stood behind the glass wall, his reflection blending into the leafy wallpaper behind the buffet. A part of him wanted to shout, to pound the glass, to tear the pot off its pedestal and smash it across the tiled floor, let its silence echo louder than the lies spoken above it. But he didn't, because what stood in that room wasn't his creation. It had no heartbeat, no heat of hands, no blistered palms or tears soaked into its side. It had no memory of Yarrow. It was a sculpture of survival, carved by people who had never been hungry. He left without speaking to anyone, walked back through the mall, where kids licked ice cream and polished shoes echoed on shiny tiles. He passed storefronts full of air-conditioned emptiness. Shoes that cost more than his family's yearly food budget. Lights that stayed on even when no one was home. He walked until the pavement gave way to dust again, until he stopped hearing his name mispronounced, until he smelled wood smoke and real mango trees. He arrived back in the village without announcement. His mother was sweeping when she saw him. She didn't ask questions. She just stepped aside and let him pass. Kwame walked to the corner of the yard, to the pot, the first one, the original. Cracked, patched, but still standing. Still breathing. It was empty now, no food inside, no leaves covering its lid. No one had touched it since he'd left. He stared at it, then knelt, then placed his palm flat on its side. The clay was cool, familiar. Then slowly he wrapped his arms around it and whispered, "I'm sorry." He didn't mean for success to become theft. Didn't know how quickly promises curdled in office air. Didn't know that innovation once rinsed of dirt lost its soul. He took a deep breath and lifted the lid. It was dry. Dust settled at the bottom. His fingers trembled. Then he picked up the hammer, the one his father had left behind, the one he had used to build the bench, the chicken coop, the stand for the pot. He stood with it in his hands for a long silent moment, then brought it down. Once, the rim cracked. Twice, the side caved. The third hit shattered it into two large jagged pieces. He kept going, until it was rubble, until it was dust again, until what had held his hope looked like the road he'd first carried Yarrow across. Then he fell to his knees and wept, not quiet tears, but full racking sobs that bent his spine and emptied his lungs. His mother approached but didn't speak. She simply laid a folded cloth on his shoulders and sat beside him in silence. Kwame gathered the shards into his arms, held them like bones, rocked gently. He had wanted to cool the world, but the world had burned what he gave it. The storm came without warning. No whisper, no slow crawl across the sky. Just a breathless moment before the heavens cracked open like a rib cage and began to scream. Wind howled down the narrow alleyways, lifting zinc roofs like sheets of paper. Rain slammed sideways into clay walls. Banana trees folded. Chickens scattered. Buckets spun in circles across courtyards like drunken dancers. And just as quickly, the lights went out. Not a flicker. A total gutting collapse. Power gone. Signal gone. Roads gone beneath rivers of angry red water. Kwame woke in the dark to the sound of something shattering. His mother's voice screamed through the house. The door had been ripped off its hinges. In the cold chaos, he stumbled barefoot through water, already ankle-deep, pushing the door shut with his shoulder jamming a plank against it. And then silence. Not peace, just the strange, suffocating hush after rage. The village had vanished into water. By morning, the destruction was complete. Tiled roofs in pieces. Storage pits flooded. Whole plantain stands flattened into pulp. And the food? Rot had bloomed like fungus overnight. Tomatoes collapsed into themselves. Onions bled black water. The smell, acidic, sickening, spread through homes like a second storm. People gathered in the center of the village. No aid was coming. The road had turned to a blood-colored river. Trotros had stopped. Phones were dead. No one had heard from Kumasi in 36 hours. Kwame stood among them, silent, watching. A woman began to cry. The last cassava I had. It melted. Someone else said, "My fridge." The back caught fire, all gone. A man added, "Even my well water smells." They all looked at each other, raw, vulnerable, broken. And then someone asked, "What about Kwame's pots?" Eyes turned, slowly, carefully. 7 of them still stood, old-patched, forgotten since the betrayal. Most were cracked. One had a broken lid. Another leaned against a wall with one foot in a puddle. But they were there. Kwame didn't speak. He simply walked over, knelt beside the nearest one, and lifted the lid. Inside, green leaves, intact, damp but fresh. Gasps. He moved to the second. More vegetables, eggplants, Contomeyer, even okra. No slime, no rot. Third, still good. By the 5th pot, a woman dropped to her knees. "You saved them." Kwame shook his head. "No, the earth did." Another voice shouted from the crowd. "He tried to give us this before. We didn't listen." The old woman with the cane from months ago pointed her stick at the crowd. "Are you listening now?" No one moved, until a young boy sprinted to his house and returned with 3 sagging tomatoes. He placed them into Kwame's hands. "Please," he said, "can you save these?" Word traveled faster than the waters. By the next day, reporters had begun arriving by foot, by motorbike, by drone. They filmed the destruction. Then they filmed the pots. No one could believe it. How 7 crude handmade clay coolers had preserved more food than every generator-powered fridge in the region. A video surfaced. A girl, maybe 22, in jeans and a dusty green t-shirt, stood in front of the camera, sweat on her brow, the wind howling behind her. "My name is Akua Mensah," she said. "I'm a journalist. My father is the same man who tried to shut this man down." The camera panned to Kwame, standing silently beside his cracked pot arms folded. Akua looked back at the lens. "But what he built is not just a fridge. It's a grave marker. A memory box. A survival device made from tears, from betrayal, from loss. This is not technology. This is love, grief, redemption. She stepped aside and let the camera capture the full frame. 7 pots, people gathered around them, mothers, children, elders. Then she turned back. They called it a primitive trick. I call it the only thing that worked. The title of her video read, "A Fridge Made of Earth, a Heart Made of Hurt." It went viral within 48 hours. Within 72 petitions began flooding in. Thousands of signatures. A demand for recognition, for apology, for justice. But none of that reached Kwame at first. He sat behind his house, away from the noise, his hands caked in wet clay, again shaping a new pot, not for a camera, not for a deal, not for redemption, just to keep something alive. Kojo came running one afternoon, waving a newspaper. "They're printing your name now, front page." Kwame didn't look up. "I don't want to be famous," he said. Kojo nodded. "I know. I just want people to eat, to not cry over rot." "You already did that." Kwame glanced at the unfinished pot. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Then I'll do it again." The room was unlike anything Kwame had ever walked into. Not because it was large, it wasn't. And not because it was grand, it wasn't that either. But because of the silence. Not the silence of poverty, not the silence of hunger, but the silence of attention. Rows of students filled the lecture hall at Ashizi University. Some wore suits, others jeans, others flowing kente sashes. Laptops were open pens poised. Every eye locked on the wooden podium at the front, lit by a soft, deliberate spotlight. Kwame stood just behind the door, heart steady but quiet. His palms, though freshly washed, still smelled faintly of earth. A young faculty member walked over and gently touched his arm. "They're ready." Kwame nodded. He had no speech in his hand. No notes. Just calloused fingers and memory. Behind the podium sat a table. On it, a replica of his first working clay refrigerator, faithfully rebuilt, imperfections and all. Beside it stood a black and white photograph in a simple wooden frame. Yaro, captured mid-run, tongue out, eyes bright. Kwame didn't remember when it had been taken. He only remembered the moment because it was the last time Yaro had chased him around the neem tree. The moderator introduced him. No elaborate title, just his name. A single sentence. "Please welcome a man who cooled more than food." Applause followed. Then stillness again. Kwame stepped up to the podium, cleared his throat, and began. "I built my first pot after a dog died in my arms." No greetings, no preamble, just the truth. The room didn't move. He continued. "His name was Yaro. He followed me home one day and stayed. Slept on wet floors, ate scraps, got sick because I couldn't keep food from rotting. He was just a dog, some people would say. But to me, he was the last creature in that house who didn't give up." Kwame paused. "I tried to build something, anything that could stop things from dying. At first it was ugly. Cracked. Stupid, some said. But then it worked. Just once. A tomato lasted 3 days longer. Then someone ate it, and didn't get sick and didn't cry." He gestured toward the clay fridge beside him. "This isn't invention," he said. "It's memory. It's hunger pressed into mud. It's my mother whispering, 'Try again.' It's 7 cracked pots that fed a village when a storm buried the road. It's my shame, my failure, my prayer." A girl in the front row wiped her eye. Kwame went on. "You asked me what this is made of. It's not just clay. It's fear. Fear of another mother having to choose between eating rot or eating nothing. It's loneliness. It's grief hardened by sun. And it's every no I ever got from a polished man in a pressed shirt." He moved from behind the podium and placed both hands on the pot. "In this, there is no wire. No coolant, no switch. Just breath. Just hope." Then quietly, he pointed at Yaro's photo. And in that there was no voice, no protest, no power. But there was loyalty. And I failed him. He returned to the podium. "And so, I built this." The silence was no longer heavy. It was sacred. He looked up at the crowd and closed with a single sentence. "I didn't build this to keep food cold. I built it to keep hope alive in poverty." And then he stepped back. The applause didn't come like thunder. It came like a wave rolling through the room, soft but unstoppable. A slow rising to feet, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, of pain, of grace, of something that could not be taught but only lived. Professors wiped their glasses. Students whispered, "He said that for me." Someone at the back whispered, "He's not an engineer. He's a historian of struggle." But Kwame didn't hear them. He had walked to the photo, lifted it from the table, and held it to his chest, as if finally someone else knew. The road home was the same dust rising in little whirls behind his sandals, same turns shaped by goat prints and forgotten stories, same neem trees leaning like elders waiting for a word. But something had changed, not the village. Him. Kwame stepped off the bus with nothing but a cloth sack over his shoulder and clay under his nails. No press, no banners, no waiting crowd, just the earth greeting him quietly like an old friend who'd always known he'd return. He walked through this main square, past the kiosk, past the schoolyard where kids chased each other between puddles. He passed the shed where he'd built the very first model, the spot where Yarrow had once curled to sleep, the stretch of wall still bearing the dent from that night. The storm snapped it in two. It was all still there. But something new waited too. Children. They were gathered along the side of the community wall, crouched low, chalk in hand, smudging brown and red across the faded cement. As Kwame approached, he slowed. A boy stood up and pointed. "That's him." Kwame smiled, hesitant. The wall was covered in drawings, crude, colorful shapes of circles stacked inside each other. Little boxes with straw lids and lines meant to be tomatoes. One child had drawn a big brown heart at the center with cracks through it, but glowing from the inside. He stepped closer. "Why are you drawing these?" A little girl no older than 7 beamed. "Because they saved our food. And because they're beautiful," her friend added. "More beautiful than fridges with lights." Kwame crouched beside them. "Can I draw one too?" They stared, then nodded. He took a piece of chalk, the blue one, and drew a pot. But this time, instead of just drawing the shape, he added something new. A pair of hands underneath it, holding it up. The kids looked. "That's Mama's hands," one of them shouted. No, Kwame whispered. "It's all of yours." Back home, his mother was in the garden. The sun fell low behind her shoulders as she knelt over a row of amaranth leaves, her fingers nimble and slow. She wore the same blue scarf she'd had since he was a child, now faded to ash gray, but tied with care. A new clay pot stood at the corner of the garden, taller than the last, its lid woven with thick, sun-bleached grass, decorated with pressed fingerprints from at least 3 generations. Kwame watched her lift a bundle of spinach brush off the dirt and lay it gently into the pot, as if laying a baby to rest. She didn't see him at first, then she did, and smiled. "Still works," she said, tapping the side. Kwame walked over and touched the clay. It was cool. It was enough. That evening, Kojo arrived with his sleeves rolled up and news in his eyes. "They want you to go to Dakar for the summit." Kwame shook his head. "Not yet." Kojo raised an eyebrow. "What?" Kwame pointed toward the garden, toward the kids drawing on the walls, toward the sky. "There's more to build here." Kojo followed his gaze, then nodded. They sat in the dirt and began to sketch blueprints into the earth. Not for factories, not for malls, but for community ovens that cooked slower, stayed hot longer, for water jars that filtered, for walls that breathed. Ideas came not like lightning, but like roots twisting back into soil already full of story. At dusk, the sound of mortar grinding pepper floated from the compound. Children laughed. Chickens called to each other. A distant drum began its evening rhythm. The camera somewhere above drifted higher. Not a drone, a storyteller's eye. It rose above the rooftops, some new, some cracked. Above the fields patchy but green. Above the schoolhouse now painted with child-sized murals of pots, dogs, mothers, tomatoes, and hands holding sunbeams. Above the village, there were dozens of them now. Clay refrigerators tucked into corners, pressed against homes, shaded under thatched roofs. Some still bore Kwame's initials, others did not, because they weren't his anymore. They belonged to the village, to the memory of hunger and the miracle of its delay, to the people who dared to believe the earth had one more gift left in it. A voice drifted in, not spoken but remembered. It wasn't the clay that kept things cold. It was the broken hearts that came together and held on to something cool when everything else was burning. The sky faded to gold. The village pulsed gently in its breath, and somewhere beneath the soil roots curled in satisfaction